really delighted that we were able to pull this together. We have 3 different panelists, one of whom, Jane Kaufman, just completed a book on the Jews of Western Massachusetts. Ken Schoen, who represents the Jewish Historical Society of Western Massachusetts, and a video that was prepared by him, Noah Koff, and probably Ken's wife, Jane Tregear, for the exhibit in the Jews of Massachusetts, Western Mass, that's in Springfield right now. And then Krista Whitney, who's the director of the oral history at Wexler, who's the patron for this, but I can't remember all the titles. But essentially, thanks to Mr. Wexler's generosity, she's doing an oral history project. It has been for a number of years out of the Yiddish Book Center, and she'll talk about that. So with that, the format today is that Ken's going to show a little video, not the whole thing, and talk for maybe 10 minutes. And then Jane, and then Krista, and then that opens up really the whole rest of our time for discussion and questions, because that's really what's fun. If all you want to do is stare at a screen, you could have stayed home and watched TV. So I think it's much more fun to do some interaction here. And I know that Jane has brought copies of her book, not just to purchase, but in fact she'll be passing some out that we can all look at as she's talking. So it'll be a great afternoon. And again, thank you. Ken, if you want to start off.
Thank you all for coming today. It's very exciting for us. I think I start with a film which was done about 6 years ago, 6 to 5 years ago. And the film was done because the community in Springfield, the Jewish community, was going through a lot of transition, a lot of changes. And we were concerned, a bunch of us up here, that a lot of the history would be lost in the closing of a whole bunch of shuls down there. So we went down there, my wife and Jane Fisher and myself, and we interviewed a whole bunch of people. And then, with the help of Noah Cork, who edited it, put it together, we prepared it's now about a 45-minute film, which discusses the history of the Jews of Springfield. For the purposes of today, Noah has edited it down to about 12 minutes, just to give you a sense of it. It is on YouTube, Memories of Springfield. You can look it up. It's a wonderful video. But for the purposes of today, it's a brief taste of the Jewish community, the life, what it was like, what it's like now, where the people got together, where they ate, give you a good sense. And after that, I'm going to raise some points about it for further discussion. And if you want more information about the Jewish Historical Society, I'd love to tell you it's really based on private donations. We get funds basically from no public institutions. It's all privately done. It's a really local kind of grassroots operation. And we hope to do Amherst next. We basically focused on Springfield, a little bit on Northampton, and we'd like to do Amherst next. So that's it for now. And Noah's going to go around, by the way, with he'll hand you
Well, for questions.
audio, if you have questions or comments, so we can take it. Okay?
Ken, if they want to see the whole movie, how would they do that?
Jewish Memories of Springfield.
Jewish Memories.
But it's all 45 minutes of it?
All 45
Oh, okay, yeah. So just Jewish Memories in Springfield on YouTube. And, Ken, you wanted still to do a little bit of discussion. Oh, Krista, you want to go? Okay. Great. Yeah. Oh, sorry about that. I've seen you.
Okay. Hi.
Oh, I turned that off.
Is this,
Just turn it on.
Hello? Hi. So I'm Krista Whitney. I am the director of the Wexler Oral History Project at the Yiddish Book Center. And I want to just talk before I show my little video, a little bit about the project, because the focus of the project is not actually the history of Jews in Western Massachusetts, but I did find a nice video that I think will fit into our discussion today that I'll show, but before I do that, so the Book Center's, the Yiddish Book Center's project is really looking at the place of Yiddish language and culture today. So where do people connect to it? How do people find meaning in it? Where is it being spoken? And where is Yiddish language and culture being transmitted? So we look at various communities, performing arts as a way that that Yiddish culture is being transmitted, family life, and the academic community, which is a main place where people are coming to the Yiddish language as it's declining as a vernacular within a non-ultra-Orthodox context. So, oral history projects generally fall into a few different categories. The Ken's project and Jane's work are really community-based, but the Yiddish Book Center's project is based around this theme of Yiddish language and culture, which is sort of by definition not placed in one geographic city, given the history of Yiddish-speaking Jews and the disbursement throughout the diaspora. So that being said, I encourage you all, if you're interested in Yiddish language and culture, to check out our exhibit at the Yiddish Book Center or online. I have some handouts if you have anyone who you think is a great candidate for our interviews. But the video that I picked out today doesn't really have anything to do with Yiddish. That's not really what we're talking about today. But I think before I show this video, I just like to, Ken's footage is about the history of the community. But I'd like to raise this idea that we are all living in a historical moment. And one thing that you can do with oral history is to document people's memories of things as far back as they can remember. But another thing that we can do is be activist historians and keep the coming generations in mind and document what is going on in the community today. So the video that I have is about a pretty recent thing that happened in this community here at the JCA. And I think it's interesting because it also raises some issues, relationship to history, and so I'll just keep those in mind as we watch this video. I'll see if I can get it. You can't depend on the internet either.
I don't know if you guys have any questions about the short video that you guys saw before you guys started. If you want to, yeah.
The Yiddish word that everybody laughed at.
Yes.
There's no Yiddish word. I'm
Well,
just interested.
Suzanne,
It's not.
It wasn't
Yes.
Yiddish, it was English. Yankee Flipper.
Yankee
all right.
Flipper.
Yeah, which was referring to the circumcision. That's what.
Yankee what?
Clipper. But actually, later in the video, they do use kind of an amalgamation. A woman does use kind of an English, Yiddish kind of amalgamation word. It was very interesting. Do you remember what the word was? So I thought that's what you might have been. But I think that's just that. Yeah. Any other questions? Sorry, I was so sad.
We have a lot more DVDs at 7 Sugarloaf Street. We've got about 50 interviews of people in Springfield, some in Northampton, plus a lot of written interviews. So if you're interested further, just give a call, come visit, you can see them. We have a lot. And Frida Howard has prepared a video on the Jews of Amherst, which you gave us a copy of too.
Has anyone done the Jews of Holyoke or Greenfield?
I think, Jane would be, do you know that question? Has anyone interviewed the Jews of Holyoke or Springfield?
No.
For a book or Greenfield, I'm sorry, Holyoke or Greenfield, yeah.
In terms of oral history, is very little.
I mean, I know that in the Western Massachusetts book, there was, I think Greenfield was touched on, right? Greenfield was. So there's information in Jane's book about Greenfield, but I don't think Holyoke. But I will say that one thing that I found that was interesting about when I was going through all these projects was the similarity in each town. The how when they moved, the types of jobs they had, the communities they built, and then the aftermath of it. So it's a similar kind of story, no matter whether you're in Springfield or Holyoke or Greenfield. So it was very interesting. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. I was asked to do this project. A lot of people wonder what were my qualifications in doing this. In fact, I was one of the rabbis that I wanted to interview to ask him what themes should be included in this book. Had a whole list of questions to me, including what qualifies you to write this book. And what my answer to him was nothing, because I have never written a book. And in fact, I still haven't written a book. I edited this book. The hardest job for me was to try to figure out how to include synagogues in a way and institutions, Jewish institutions. I spent ages, it felt like ages, outline after outline after outline, trying to figure out the best organizational structure. And I want to credit Jane Trugere, who helped me realize that thematically would be the best way to do it. So the book opens, as many of you may have already noticed, with a chapter on rituals. And because I thought that the most interesting part of the Jewish community isn't necessarily its history, which in some ways is very parallel to a lot of other ethnic histories. People face persecution, they come to America, or they hope they won't face persecution, then they face more persecution, and they deal with it in some way. That's kind of the broad brush outline. So I opened with rituals, which is really what makes Jews distinctive from other ethnic groups, is that we have a shared set of rituals. So it opens with a oral interview, and a lot of the book is oral interviews, of Henry Simkin, who was for many years the local and only mohel in this area. The closest mohels were in probably Worcester, West Hartford, and Albany. So he had a monopoly until, I think, maybe until Scott Siege moved into town, and Scott lives in Amherst. So, and then it moves on to bar mitzvah, and I did life cycle, weddings, and Chevra Katisha, and funerals. I wanted to do something on divorce, but I couldn't find anyone who wanted to be interviewed about their get. So I did not include divorce. From there, it moves on to a chapter about kashrut, and people have argued with me about whether or not the story about Harold Chernock actually belongs in the chapter about kashrut. But Harold Chernock was a Springfield butcher. You're nodding because you grew up in Springfield, Barbara, and you remember him. He was a license commissioner who wielded with a very powerful fist, and he fought the city of Springfield's Sunday blue laws because he took Friday evenings and Saturdays off for Shabbat, or Shabbos as he probably called it, and he wanted to be able to sell on Sundays. Well, that was antithetical to Massachusetts blue laws, which dated to, I think, 100 years prior to the Constitution. The U.S. Supreme Court strangely ruled in favor of Springfield, and he was not allowed to open on Sundays for many years, and I don't know when he finally was able to open on Sundays, but he basically challenged those laws and lost. And that decision was included in a book edited by a guy named Joel Joseph and written by a guy named Joel Joseph, who happens to hail from my area, my neck of the woods. He's from Cleveland Heights originally. I'm from Shaker Heights, Ohio. And he now lives in LA. He's written a book called Worst Decisions of the Supreme Court, and he said that Harold Chernock's decision will make the 4th edition. He said, I keep having to update it because the Supreme Court makes such awful decisions. This is all in the book. I'm not telling you anything that isn't in the book. One of the pieces I was most excited about working on appears in the 3rd chapter, and that is the piece with Sheila, your former rabbi. I wanted to do a piece, and I felt that this would be a great way to draw together Western Massachusetts Judaism and Jewish communities by focusing on the 4 pioneering, in my opinion, pulpit women rabbis. So that piece features Joyce Golaski, Sheila Peltz-Weinberg, Deborah Zecher, who's in Great Barrington, and Amy Watt-Cass in Springfield. So I did not include in that piece Nancy Flam, whom I consider to be sort of my personal rabbi right now. But and people have said to me, "Is Nancy in the book now?" but those other 4 women are. Rather than to read to you from it, which I thought I might do, I feel like you might be a bit taxed from having to wait. But I would be happy to read a short piece if you are interested. Otherwise, I'll just kind of continue this yarn. Does this better? Okay. I was daunted about how to handle synagogues generally. And I finally realized that writing about synagogues was going to be a complete bore to most people, that nobody cared about anyone else's synagogue history except their own, if they are affiliated, have a synagogue, and care about its history. Now, I really do care about my own personal synagogue's history. I belong to the congregation of B'nai Israel and have since I moved here. But, and I have a very strong connection there. But I'm also a wanderer, and I have showed up at services here. So if I look familiar to you, it's because I occasionally come over the bridge to say hi to Irv and Linda and meet them here. But, and other friends here. So while I am interested in synagogue history generally, I realize that most people probably would not, and that it would end up being a bricks and mortar recount of like how people raise money to build things. And I thought, that's got to be the most boring thing to read. The same goes for institutions. I felt that writing an institutional history of, say, the Jewish nursing home would just about kill everyone who read it. So instead of writing that kind of history, I decided to do a chapter. By the way, Jane Trigere beautifully wrote a piece on the history of synagogues in Springfield, most of which, as you know, have disappeared. And that seems important to me, and I'm glad that she did that. That was a big contribution. She had done previously a piece for a master's thesis on the architecture of those synagogues, but in doing so, and also in doing this project, she and Ken explored the history of those communities, and so she was able to write a really beautiful piece. I still cannot keep straight the names of all the synagogues in Springfield. I can't even tell you how many there were, but Jane knows, and so she was able to write a really good piece about that. Regarding the institutions, I decided the best way to handle the big Jewish institutions in Springfield would be to write a piece about each of them, but focusing on one particularly interesting program. So the Jewish Federation was really the hardest one for me. I was like, what am I going to do with that? I ended up doing a piece about Rachel's Table, and that seemed like a really nice way of showcasing them. For the JCA, there's a piece about their inclusion camp for kids with disabilities called Kahila. That's that initiative there, and so I focus on a couple kids and a couple counselors and about how that whole effort works. Let's see, for Jewish Family Services, which has got such a central position in immigration, I talked with Bob Marmore, and he and I agreed that focusing on one Iraqi refugee who now works for JFS, but had immigrated with the help of JFS, would make sense. So that person is the only Muslim centerpiece in the book. I wanted to focus on rabbis who I really like and respect. And there were two that came to mind immediately. And they were Yehiel Lander, and so I got a chance to talk with him and about his history here, but also his efforts at starting the Lander Grinspoon Academy in Northampton. And the other rabbi who I really wanted to showcase was Rabbi Jerome Gerland. So I did real interviews with those guys. And by the way, I'll tell you this, and I have not told any other audience this. This is a yearbook. All of the pieces in here who have living people interviewed in them, whom I could find, those pieces have all been vetted. So this is not pure journalism. This is public relations. But I will also tell you this. People didn't change much. So if they wanted to change their quotations, I was like, fine. I would never do that in a news story. I work for the newspaper. And this was a project of the newspaper. But their changes were so slight that, in fact, I feel it really is a piece of journalism. I just wanted to, I feel like it's good to come clean with that and with an educated audience. So Rabbi Jerome Gerland and Rabbi Yehiel Lander and everyone else who appears in this book, and I advise all of the other contributors to it to do the same, to submit their finished pieces to the people who were their narrators or their sources, and ask them to make sure that they were comfortable and that it felt accurate. And as I said, most of the changes were minor. But I think everyone felt better about doing it this way. This way there are far fewer inaccuracies. I was much more worried about having inaccuracies than I was about missing some truth. So that there is, I think, a great deal of truth in here. I would like to read one piece. I want to read a piece about snobbery in the Jewish community in Springfield. So how am I doing for time? Who's timing?
I think you're fine.
Okay. So I just feel like, having seen this piece, that it might be instructive and interesting. Thank you. That would be fantastic. So most of the pieces in the book have one source. This is one of the few that actually has many. I believe it's It's on 70, page 70. So if you're holding the book, I think this is on page 77. And you're welcome to follow along with me. Yes, it's called In Jewish Community Hierarchies Emerge. So well, I'm going to just read. Just because Springfield's Jews weren't on the top of the social heap in the early 20th century and experienced a fair degree of anti-Semitism didn't mean that they couldn't establish their own pecking order. In many American cities, German Jews who were often affiliated with the greatly assimilated Reform movement rose to the top of the heap. Springfield's population of largely Eastern European Jews established Orthodox synagogues, and social divisions began to arise between neighborhoods rather than ethnicity. The North End, which was settled first, had the first synagogues on Grays Avenue, Dwight, and Congress Streets. For decades, it featured many of the necessities and luxuries of Jewish life: delicatessens, bakeries, butchers, and kosher restaurants. Housing was crowded. I think a lot of people originated on Bell Street, said Evelyn Barron, who lived there as a child. It was not just Jews. We were Anglo, Syrians, Polish people, Americans, and Irish. We moved 3 times on Bell Street. In the first move, the family downsized from 5 to 4 rooms in order to save $8 per week to send her brothers to college. I always slept in the same room as my brothers, she said. I didn't know any different. I slept in a crib till I was 8 years old. It was a brown metal crib, and if I saw it today, I would know it. We remained in the North End, Barron said. A bulk of the people moved to Forest Park. Fellows from Forest Park did not want to date girls from the North End. Families moved to Forest Park thinking they would better themselves. We couldn't. My father was a house painter. Irving Gold's father had a store, Gold's Creamery, on Ferry Street. He used to make his own butter, Gold said. He had a churn and back. He used to get his milk and cream from a farmer in Vermont. It was just before Pesach. He had his front windows displayed with Passover goods. Somebody blew it up. That was in 1932, April. His father chose to start over in a more upscale neighborhood, the X, at Dickinson, Belmont, and Sumner Avenues. When we were down on Ferry Street, it was kosher, Gold said, but when we were in the park, he snuck in a few non-kosher items, displayed some hams, and got some non-Jewish customers. Still, just because Forest Park was a wealthier neighborhood did not mean it was not necessarily more hospitable to Jews than the North End. Seymour Frankel was born in the North End. His family moved to Trafton Road on the edge of Forest Park when he was just a year old. There were just so many things we couldn't do, he said. On Trafton Road, there was only one non-Jewish family, the Kellys, and they would always find the Jewish boys and beat us up. Like many people of his generation, he remembers being insulted in junior high and high school. Still, he recalled the snobbery of the Forest Park Jews. There was a great division between what was still the North End and Forest Park, he said. Some of the people living up here in Forest Park just didn't want to have anything to do with the North End people. Frankel fought the social distinctions among Jews when he had the opportunity as a student at Classical High School. When it came to dances, I would always call a girl from the North End. They may not have been as fortunate, but they certainly were as nice as we were. That's it for me. Thank you.
You guys ready?
Thank you.
I'd like to just make some observations I've been thinking about today and some of the work we did in Springfield. So some brief observations before we open it up for discussion. And I think the observations may lead to some further discussion. One of the things I was thinking about is, how does one define what is a Jewish community? What is a Jewish community? What makes it Jewish? How does it evolve? How does it perpetuate itself? What keeps it going? That's a really key question. And that was a key question we faced in Springfield with the closing of at least 3 synagogues, the merging into one. You know, what keeps a synagogue going? Now, I'm not that familiar, frankly, with Amherst. That's what you're here for today, partly. But I think Amherst and Northampton are very untraditional in terms of the Jews moving up here as compared to Springfield. Springfield, the Jews moved here basically in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, same thing in Hartford, 1860s, 1860s. And most of them were Russian Jews. And they all lived together, you know, around Ferry Street in the beginning. As they got more wealthy, they moved from the North End to Forest Park. And then from Forest Park, what happened? They moved to Longmeadow, and Forest Park has begun to, you know, see changes too, right? So it's a very close-knit community. I think Amherst was formed more as a, in some ways, I think, as refugees from urban settings. Came up to, let's be in the country. I think that's more like it. And I think the university, please you'll correct me if I'm wrong, was one of the major draws that brought Jews here in the beginning. And then more and more Jews came here to go to the university, and they stayed on. And Jane has an expression which is, Amherst is made up of professors, poets, potters, and potheads. Anyway, so it's just an expression. But I think in some ways, being up in Amherst and Northampton is, you've got to be a little bit more, I wouldn't use the word assimilated, but much more with the world as compared to being in Springfield, where if you're Orthodox, you live close to each other and you live close to the shul because you can't drive on Shabbos. Whereas here, we're much more of a car community. We're driving around, we're more suburban. So this is a very big difference with Amherst, Northampton, and Springfield. And I wonder, you can tell me, when the Jews moved to Amherst and Northampton, did they tend to congregate together in the same neighborhoods? Or did they just spread out helter-skelter randomly? Or was there some kind of hidden, quiet, restrictive covenants in the beginning which kept Jews out? I've heard things like that in Northampton. I don't know if it's true, but I've heard about that. But the Jewish community is very diverse, especially in Amherst. We all know that. There are Jews who are gastronomical Jews, they're musical Jews, they're religious Jews, they're bar mitzvah Jews. There are all kinds of Jews here. It's hard to define what is a Jewish community. But we all know that when a Jewish community gets started in an area, what's the first thing they put up? What's the first thing? Cemetery. Is that true for Amherst? Tell me.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. First thing is a cemetery.
No.
Sunday school was first.
It was social, and then we had the Sunday school. We didn't get the cemetery from the club.
Okay, so we'll discuss that. I'd like to hear about that. All right, if we can talk about it. So the cemetery is the first thing, then the social clubs in some ways, like self-help groups often, and then the synagogues. And sometimes the synagogues start out as meeting in someone's home or meeting in a hall. And that happened in Springfield too in the beginning, until you get some money, which brings us to the next question, which is how do you fund these things? How do you fund buildings? Now in Springfield, the guys started out as peddlers, literally, packs on their backs, and they went out. Eventually they were able to open up little shops. But most of them were peddlers. And they were businessmen, and a lot of them were very successful. And it's the businessmen who were the pillars of the community, and they supported the shuls. Why did the shuls go down in Springfield, let's say, 10 years ago? Why did it start to happen? I think partly because the businessmen no longer had the same kind of funding, and they weren't able to support them anymore in the way they were able to, in terms of all the bills. They built some really enormous buildings. So that's a major question in terms of who's supporting the Jewish community. And in Springfield, it was the businessmen in the beginning. We heard a lot of stories about all the very successful guys who started out with nothing and really worked hard to do it. Now, the next point to that is, in Springfield, the children of these businessmen stayed. And, the 1920s, 1930s, and they continued the businesses often. Father and son, mother, daughter, whatever. But, they continued the businesses. That's very important. Why is that important? Because the leadership remained in the same family too. The head of the shul, father to son, let's say. Hadassah. You could count on the children to continue and stay in the community. What happened with the Second World War? After the Second World War, you had the GI Bill. The guys came back and they went off to college, and they no longer wanted to be merchants and shopkeepers or what have you. They became doctors and lawyers. And the rabbi here, his stepfather, Dr. Hafetz, his father was a rag picker, a paper guy. That's what he did for a living. And what is Dr. Hafetz? He's a surgeon. The guys got the GI Bill, they went to college, and they got educated, and they did not remain in the community. That's very important. The question I would pose to all of you is, how many of your kids are going to remain in the Western Massachusetts, and how many are going to move away? And if they do come back, what draws them back besides the grandchildren issue, which I think is very powerful. But my concern is that a lot of the kids we see nowadays go off. They go out into the world, and it's constantly in transition. And how do you keep the Jewish community vibrant with all kinds of newcomers, which is a big issue, but I think that's very true. Whereas in Springfield, it was very different. I think another issue we face here has to do with the cost of housing. If my kid would want to move to Northampton or Amherst, it's very expensive now. You really need to have a very powerful job. That's a real issue in terms of bringing more people here. That's why a lot of people move up here coming from New York, I think, and they're selling their apartment, whatever. So it's a very different world than it was when I moved here in the early 80s. Also, in Springfield, as I said, the Jews live close together. And I think out here, and you can correct me, I think it's much more spread out, more diverse community. Now, the other question I'd like to ask for discussion is, where do you shop? If you're looking for kosher food, let's say, or Jewish-style food, where do you go now, and where would you go? How often did you go to Springfield? Was that where you went? Did you go to Ferry? No, maybe not Ferry Street. You go to, where did you go to shop? I know that Stop and Shop now has Empire and kosher food, and they have herring, whatever. But where would you shop if you were looking for that? Are there delis that you would go to? Is it, huh? Trader Joe. Now, it's interesting also that Stop and Shop for Passover has a major Passover section, right? That's very different. That's community pressure, I think.
Stop and Shop was a Jewish store in the old days.
Was. No, it was?
Yeah.
Okay. Now the other issue is the merchants in Springfield, they all, there are a lot of shops, Jewish shops. In Northampton in the 1940s and 50s, there were a lot of Jewish merchants up and down Main Street. A lot. Now, tell me today, are there many Jewish merchants in downtown Amherst or in Northampton? I don't know. If there are they identified as Jews? Would you say, oh, the guy who owns that is Jewish and da-da-da-da-da, or it's Jewish food or whatever? I think it's a very different world in terms of the merchants, whereas back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, you could go down to certain streets and there would be a lot of Jewish merchants there. There's another issue which I think is very interesting in terms of the evolution of the Jewish community, which I think we face here, I think they face in Northampton, I think they face somewhat in Springfield too, and that is, one of the purposes of establishing a synagogue is what? What's one of the basic purposes? Education, the future of your generation, right? What else? What? Life cycle. What else? Why do people basically establish a synagogue, a shul? Community. What else? Services, to pray. Wasn't the reason originally to set up a synagogue to pray? Let's get together, and they would pray every day, like twice a day, and shopping. That was the original intent, I think, at least in Springfield, let's say, with the Orthodox communities, very much it was we get together, we pray, that's what we do, and we see each other Friday night and Saturday. It's a big issue now, here, Northampton, and parts of Springfield, to get meetings. What's happened? What's happened to the evolution of the concept of synagogue and prayer? I don't know if that's relevant for us today, but that's an important point to think about in terms of the future. And there's some other things, but I'll leave it for now. So I hope this opens up some further discussion. Thank you.
Well, anyway. Krista, since I'm assuming the Ted Traubach thing isn't going to run, well, why don't you come up here?
Can I just try?
Yeah, please do.
Not with.
Try different technology.
Yeah, trying to. Because I actually think, given the questions you're raising, Kevin, it's a really interesting intergenerational story. So,
we're going to like
Oh.
They all
her class, the bat mitzvah class, wanted to sort of, on the Friday before a kid's bat mitzvah, have a pride day where they would all dress up in the same sort of way before they went to middle school. And one year, one Friday, they decided to wear little orange Jewish stars that said Jew Crew on it. And they went to school with that star. One teacher made a kid take the star off. Another teacher smiled and said, wow, hey, that's really cool. You can imagine that there was a bit of a hullabaloo afterwards, after the parents found out about it. And the principal, Mike Hayes, his response was, this is really interesting. If you do it again, maybe you could tell the kids the other students in the school what it means. So when you do it, they'll understand it. He saw this. He was aware of the controversy it caused. And his attitude was, well, the way we can make it not a controversy is let's bring everybody in on it and tell everybody what's going on. And I thought that was a great response, as opposed to, let's avoid controversy, don't do it again. So I was really impressed with his response. Unfortunately, the kids didn't do it again, so the principal's plan never had a follow-through on it. But the parents in the JCA also had a huge, wide range of opinion. And many of the parents, most of the parents of the seventh graders met. And one woman said that her father was in tears when he heard it. He just couldn't understand. We have a friend who's a child survivor of the Holocaust. And she said to my wife, listen, that's wonderful, good for them, that's marvelous. She was thrilled that they were taking ownership of this instead of avoiding the stigmas. It's sort of like the gays taking over the pink triangle, which during the Holocaust had been a sign of shame, and now it's a sign of pride. And so, and you saw this as how wonderful. And the parents, my attitude was great, good for them, But a lot of the parents who were raised Jewish, they didn't understand why anyone would want to make a point of calling attention to themselves. And so, several parents expressed the ambivalence of really proud and happy that their kids feel safe enough to say, hey, I'm Jewish and I'm having a bar mitzvah tomorrow. But on the other hand, still sort of recoiling because when they were a kid, they would never have felt safe doing that. So I think that story paints a picture of what it's like to be Jewish in Amherst.
This is the first one.
Yeah, I mean, this is way
You want to open it up to discussion?
Yeah. Well, Krista made some points. Krista, what year was that controversy? Because honestly, I don't remember it, but that's because my kids probably had come and gone through the schools by then.
Well, I'm actually not sure the year that this isn't
A
on.
couple of years ago.
It was a few years ago.
3 years ago.
Maybe.
2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah.
Oh, so it's very recent. Yeah.
Like a year or two before the term, which was 2 years ago.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting through that example that you see the different reactions to, is Jewish identity public or private? How is Jewish identity expressed in different ways across different generations? As the community around the Jewish community changes through different periods of history. And then also with this particular case, how does the relationship to the memory of persecution and particularly the Holocaust change across generations? What is the second, third generation past the Holocaust? What is the relationship to history? How is that different? And how does that make earlier generations uncomfortable, proud? I just think that's sort of some questions that we should think about when we're talking about Ken's questions of how to keep a community going. Yeah.
A similar kind of issue has come up with me and my daughters. I think they're past it now, but when they wanted to get tattoos. tattoos. And they want to get tattoos because people are getting tattoos and they're cool and they're fun. And I didn't want them to get tattoos. One is, well, partly I was raised in the, I guess now, old Jewish tradition that you don't deface your body in that way, but also because I felt that our forebears, some of whom are still among us, were forced to have tattoos, and this would be a mocking thing. Then my daughter showed me an article, which I think might have been in Hadassah magazine, but I'm not sure, where young Jews, young Jewish adults and teens were doing that taking over of the tattoo. And they were, I think one had his grandfather's number tattooed on them, and others had Hebrew lettering tattooed on them. And they were making that argument with me. And somehow I actually won this one, which is really unusual. It probably involves some sort of bribe, but I think they really got it, that I don't ask that much for them, and it was really important to me because I personally felt it was just not respecting the horrible persecution.
Yeah, I'm saying that I think all of this has come up because I think that there's like a sort of panel thing, and I'm just here because I'm officially supposed to be moderating it, but there's no moderation required. You guys are fine.
So I wanted to respond to this. Oh, but maybe you did.
My question, Christy's probably there too. There was, a couple of weeks ago, a class from Deerfield, and I don't know the difference between South Deerfield and North, so I can't say that, but this teacher came, and the kids were not just walking through, oh, this is interesting, they were sitting down, they were learning, they were really seeing what Judaism is. And it was at the Yiddish Book Center, and I was so impressed that these teachers wanted to give these kids a real idea of the Holocaust, but who are these people? And doing it in a positive, caring way. And so I would like to see more of the schools, Amherst and such, following this kind of event, and not just with Jews, but with us, way that kids can feel proud about themselves and comfortable with those who are not.
Do you want to respond first?
No, I think it's important that other people respond before I
I think, unfortunately, when it comes to multiculturalism, Jews and Judaism don't seem to fit. So we're sort of not a minority anymore in most people's estimation. That's my opinion.
I came today because I was interested in people telling their stories. I don't care what you call your tribe or your people, whether you're Irish or whether you're Catholic from Philadelphia. The stories need to be told. And if you're going to look to a monolithic public school system to do it, not happening. The secularization is, in your stories, it's generational, and it's a secularization of society that it's made it difficult to have a conversation. So unless we all decide our stories are important and tell them to our children's children, they will be lost. It's not going to happen. There's too much political correctness in public schools. So I encourage everyone, tell your stories to your family.
I'd like to, go ahead.
I also live in Deerfield, where Ken lives, and I have some friends, young students, that live in my immediate neighborhood, and so I know that Frontier Regional, which is both middle school and high school, they have whole units on the Holocaust, because my neighbor comes to talk to me, and she was so enthused studying it. Might be the same group of people.
Might be. I was so impressed with the teachers and the kids, though.
It's fantastic. Whereas other towns in the valley, like East Hampton, they had a pile of Holocaust literature from Ken. They were in the process of throwing it out. When I walked into the library, I had been teaching there, and I said, with about 100 National Geographics, and I was like, I will take all of this. And then I saw the Holocaust literature, and I had to act, I will take all of this too. So I was able to retrieve the incredibly wonderful and probably rare books that Ken and Jane had left with the East Hampton Public Schools.
Before we get too far afield, I just wanted to respond to the video. Who's the person who was Ted Trump. Okay. So I have a similar story about actually the title of my book. That went through several iterations. I'm not going to repeat the entire story, but I want to let you know that the use of the word Jews became an issue in the title. And I actually posed the question to my mother, do you find that offensive in this context? And she said, I do. So, you could say the Jewish people or something.
Yeah.
Sort of,
Jewish.
Add the ish, it's a little less charged.
It is.
So,
But it's not right.
I really felt it was important to reclaim it. And finally, the way to win the argument with the most vociferous opponent of that use of that word, I was able to find this was a stroke of genius on the part of Joe Carvalho, who was a lead contributor in the book. So look at that Hartford history. What word do they use? Jews. And that I wrote a letter, a very pointed letter, saying we need to reclaim this language. And there is nothing inherently negative about the word Jews. It's only in the context of dirty Jew that it becomes dirty. So anyway.
Jewish West Hartford, starting over the formation of the Jews of Springfield, and this one written by the Jews of Paradise. There was no issue there, right? I just want to say one quick comment about the Holocaust and teaching the Holocaust. It's kind of distressing if you think that the outside world, how are they learning about Jews? By studying the Holocaust? That's not exactly how I want the outside world to know about Jewish life and Jewish people today. We want to honor the Holocaust, but we don't want that to be the major focus of what people are learning about the Jews. That was the purposeful destruction of our people. So the PC thing is, would public school kids come to a synagogue? I don't know. Will they take kids to churches? I don't know. It's a whole area that's not being explored. I mean, how do you know your neighbor? In the old days, you used to go to a service of your friend and you'd see what they were doing. But I certainly wouldn't want the Holocaust to be the emphasis of what Jewish education is. And I know here at Frontier, you're right, they have a whole Holocaust curriculum. I don't think they have any Jewish curriculum, huh?
It's connected to World War II.
Yeah, but still.
But the Diary of Anne Frank is how some people begin to understand about the Holocaust.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that Amherst was one of the first communities in the country to have the Holocaust in the curriculum, courtesy of Mr. Gerstein, was it Mark Gerstein, who died this year. And all our kids took that course when they were in Amherst High School.
Ken, that was why I was impressed that they weren't just doing the Holocaust, they were having an experience of
Jewish culture.
Jewish culture.
Just to add to your, scholar, and he just wrote a book, and he's getting all kinds of speaking engagements and awards and such. The name of it is Jews and Roosevelt.
Okay.
His name is Brightman, Richard Brightman.
Oh, sure.
I just want to say there's a geometry teacher at the Amherst High School. His name is Mr. Friedman. And as part of his early in the year geometry, he brings in this apple peeler where you put the apple on and you turn it and he peels the apple, and then he lets them eat it with honey. And he talks about the geometry of something to do with the apple core, and he also tells them why he decided to bring in apples and honey. And I'm kind of surprised that he didn't get flack about it, but I guess he does it every year, and I like that.
It's interdisciplinary.
Yeah.
It's brilliant. Probably he was describing this.
Hi. So one thing I want to say is I think if we were to interview youth across the valley, it would be a really interesting thing. I know that my niece and nephew in the Williamsburg schools experienced anti-Semitism, direct anti-Semitism. In Belchertown, I think we literally figured out that, if there are, if you take 100% of kids growing up in Belchertown, 80% of them are in intermarried families. And so their interaction is different, and their interaction when they get to the JCA with the Amherst Jewish kids is a whole thing. So I'm interested in those intersections, and I wanted to ask you, Jane, about what you learned about the institutions that were connecting through the Council of Churches, the Jewish war veterans, the City of Homes, those things in Springfield that were trying to be connected to the rest of the community, if you have any stories.
I unfortunately did not explore that issue at all. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has, or if there's anyone in the audience who can respond to your question, but I didn't go there. I had too much to cover until 4:30 to go to any faith questions. But I will say this, regarding the issue of anti-Semitism, most of the people I interviewed were over the age of 70. Not all of them, but all the people I interviewed over the age of 70 had experienced, and it didn't matter where they were from. They could have been from Germany, living in Germany at the time of Kristallnacht, or they could have been living in Holyoke, or in, I interviewed somebody who I think grew up in like Brockton. It didn't matter. Everyone experienced anti-Semitism at least once, and it was usually from another kid, and usually it would involve physical violence, but not always. It often involved the words dirty Jew, and it was chilling to every one of them. It only took one incident.
Once they were here, you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying wherever they were as children, it didn't matter if they were in Germany or if they were in Brockton or if they were in Holyoke or if they were in Springfield. Almost everyone I interviewed had an anti-Semitic traumatic incident in their memory that they related to me.
Yeah, I want to get back to this issue of how people identify Jewishly, because I think for the older generation, the people you interviewed, the parts of the videotape that we saw, for them, for a lot of them, it was identification through the synagogue, through the shul. But in recent surveys that have been done with younger people, they don't identify religiously. But when people ask them, the surveyors ask them, do you identify Jewishly? They say yes. And it's through the culture. They have no problem saying, I'm Jewish and I'm proud of being Jewish, but not necessarily religiously. So that's very interesting. I think the real issue, it's fascinating to me that a lot of Israelis don't identify Jewishly. They say, I'm Israeli. I'm not necessarily Jewish. Because for them, what we see as Jewish identity, although not necessarily religiously, they see as part of their national identity. Purim's a national holiday. Pesach is a national holiday. They see those things as part of their national identity. They don't necessarily see it as Jewish identity. And that, to me, is absolutely fascinating. Young people here say, I'm not religious, but I'm Jewish. So, and they see it as a cultural identity. So I find those differences absolutely fascinating. And the young people here see themselves as part of the Jewish community, but not religiously.
So an interesting difference between Springfield and Amherst is that in the 1920s, there was one Jewish family in Amherst, and so what it was like to be a Jewish student at the university at that time is revealed actually in the papers of someone who was a student and came back to be a professor. His name is Max Goldberg. There's quite a lot of detail there. Have you seen it, David?
I know that Rob just picked up another interview with someone who was like at UMass in the 1920s, was Jewish.
Uh-huh.
So there aren't very many.
Yeah, so they would be invited by this family to come for Passover, the few Jewish students that there were, and And there was some question as time went on about whether the president ought to allow a Jewish fraternity to be formed. And he wrote to college presidents all over the country about whether or not he ought to do this. I'm not sure what his fear was. It may have been some paternalistic thing for their own good, that they should be, spread out. Or anyway, it was really interesting. But I think the fact that there are not long generations of Jews in Amherst the way there are in Springfield affects how it feels to be a member of this synagogue, where if you've come from one that was made up of generations, and here we have all come together newly in our own generation to form this synagogue, and it feels very different.
Comment on that one of the things that, I've been, in Western Mass since 1986, so that's a long time, and grew up in the Philadelphia area. And one of the things that really has always struck me about the Jewish community in Amherst and Western Mass is, on the one hand, there may not be all that many Jews in Western Mass, but on the other hand, almost all these families have some tie to New York or to Boston or to Hartford. I'm stretching a little bit down to go to Philadelphia, but I'm thinking about this in terms of Jewishness, that a lot of people will visit grandparents who'll be, maybe 2 hours away instead of living next door. But it's kind of, thanks to the automobile, it's a little more geographically dispersed, but there are connections that a lot of the people in Western Mass have to the more urban, established, long-time Jewish communities, even though they themselves aren't like inside of one, literally inside of Amherst. So that's just one comment. I have another very brief comment that I want to make, just because I'm thinking of it. And that is, Jane, when you mentioned the oral histories, because we teach oral history at UMass, I'm in the history department. And one of the things that is really standard practice is that after you do the interview and you get a transcript, you give it back to the person. They have a chance to make corrections and additions and all that, and that's what you go with. And so we may, that's just sort of good manners. So what you were doing, even though it may have felt a little uncomfortable for a journalist, in fact, is for an oral historian standard, and actually the Oral History Association has standards and say that's actually something you're supposed to do.
The caveat of that is that when you're transcribing an interview, so it's actually different within the standards of the field if you're doing and this is actually a big debate within the larger Oral History Association now, whether what is the original? Is it the recording, or when you edit it, what do you need to keep the original and in what form? And so I think but that is really an interesting issue of whether, for example, for our interviews, you can't really vet a video in the same way you can text. So it's different as the medium changes. Yeah.
No, that's very true.
First of all, I think it would be mean-spirited if we didn't congratulate Jane on her achievement. It's a wonderful achievement, Jane. Secondly, we have to quote Shelley in saying that although heard songs are sweet, those unheard are sweeter. And there are many songs of the area that have yet to be heard. So we hope that this will be the first edition. I'd like to I join with you about telling stories about our neighborhood. And one of the stories I'd like to tell would be to expand the notion that all of the immigrants who came to Western Massachusetts turned out to be butchers and tailors and ich weiß was. There is an interesting story about one immigrant family called the Levin family that came to Northampton. And they apparently were post-1905 revolutionary survivors. And Louis Levin was described to me as being one of those Russian Jewish intellectuals who smoked a cigarette through a cigarette holder. And they were very much dismissive of the Orthodox kleinstädtische the small town Jewish community. And so Louis XI set up a Louis XI fund whose interest was to be dedicated to Jewish cultural issues other than the synagogue. No? When I arrived as a former kibbutznik, who else would be appropriate for the board of directors of a non-synagogue directed fund? And we've dedicated money to issues having to do with Jewish cultural events. Among them, a lecture by the late Baskin and other of the sort. But I think probably the most important thing that the Louis XI Fund did was, since I was also then among my official duties, the vice president of the board of directors of the then very tiny Yiddish book center, I was able to make available $1,000 for the Yiddish book center. And that gave the Yiddish book center its first housing in Florence, which, as I recall, was an unheated basement to a pottery shop. But anyway, I simply want to point out that there were more than butchers and bakers, and that the Levin Fund, which lasted till a few years ago, sparked, as I say, Jewish cultural events other than the synagogue. But I have to tell you a secret, but somehow the synagogue got a projector and all kinds of other educational events. But of course they weren't religious, it was a projector.
I just wanted to mention my field is at the moment writing fiction, and Levelers Press has published my novel last year. What I want to bring up is the fact that one of the top 100 novels ever written, or written and highly treasured, was written by an Irishman about a Jew. And he made this Jew such a wonderful guy that you wish you knew him, Leopold Bloom. And James Joyce is the Irishman who wrote the novel. And, of course, he made himself very famous. And with the help of American publishers, he finally made a few bucks on the book. That's about all. I had a little to say about folklore, Irish folklore and Jewish folklore, two things that fascinate me. I grew up on Irish folklore. My mother was from Ireland and told me stories. But I found similar stories in Isaac Singer and so forth. And everybody has the same stories.
Just a very quick comment to tie all that together is that this congregation has probably the foremost Rebbe who's also a Joyce scholar.
Yes. So the question I would also then stay with is if we're a lot of cultural Jews, if that's what's happened in terms of the next generation, can that perpetuate itself? Can being culturally Jewish perpetuate itself to the next generation and the next generation? What is the glue that holds us together as a Jew, that keeps it going? I mean, that's really a significant question in terms of, community. And as you pointed out, Linda, this is a very new community, where a lot of us are just refugees, so to speak, from other areas. It's all new. It's not founded in 1890 or 1900 or, we're really new. And how do we keep it strong and our kids continue it? That, for me, is really or is it constant turnover and new interests and new, I think something we haven't talked about, having a good rabbi is very important in terms of binding a community and getting people to come to shul for whatever reason they come, be it cultural or religious. You need someone who can inspire you. I think that's really important in terms of a community. Do you want to say something?
Your question is something I've thought about a lot, and now we have spread out geographically generation by generation. we're safer than we've been in this country than anywhere. So I think as we start to spread out, some of the forces that held us together from the outside have changed. And I think that's part of the complication of the question. In addition to the safety allowing for greater assimilation in the larger culture. And so then the question is, do we come together as Jews in future generations because we have to or because we want to? And what keeps that, whatever Judaism is, alive enough that people still want to do it? And so I think, when I think of Judaism right now, and I think of Jewish renewal and the kind of, from my frame, re-spiritualization of Judaism from the inside out, that to me is one of the new directions that I think can help Jews rebirth as communities.
Perhaps I'm paranoid, but I always feel like the wandering Jew and the lessons of history are that you can be a German Jew, a French Jew, a Dutch Jew, and when things come to a bad end, like we'll see what happens with Ukraine right now, the Jews are always the ones who suffer. I mean, that's my take on things. So I think we can never be too comfortable as Jews anywhere.
Yeah, I think I'd like to sort of comment on the last two comments. I think it's really important that we help folks understand that we're connected to the rest of the Jewish community outside of the United States, because we also are seeing an increase in the rise of anti-Semitism in other countries. And we can feel very comfortable about being here, even though we see little incidences of anti-Semitism even in this country. But we also know that one of the largest immigrations to Israel, aliyah to Israel in the last few years, has been from France to Israel, from French Jews who've lived in France for many generations. And continuously we're hearing more anti-Semitic acts in other countries in Europe. So I think it's important that we help the younger generation of Jews in this country connect with what's happening to our Jewish communities in other countries, because we may feel safe, comparatively speaking, but there's the rest of the world, and they need to understand that we are connected to those Jews as well. So I think the last two comments were really important. And yes, the Ukraine is starting to talk about the Jews in Ukraine, and that a lot of the problems in Ukraine now have to do with the Jews. So it's really important that we be aware and we pass that awareness onto our children, our young adult children, our adult children, that may not be the synagogue, but we need to reconnect them to the Jewish community at large in the rest of the world.
I think also hate groups are definitely on the rise in the U.S. I'm not sure of the statistics. I think my husband can better tell about that because we belong to the Southern Poverty Law Center. And, you tell. How many hate groups are there in this country?
Numbers around 1,200 or so. Actually, the incidence of anti-Semitism in the U.S. has declined slightly by 1% or 2% over the last year or so. But if you actually go online, you can see an enormous spiking in the online presence of anti-Semitism in America. I think American Jews are in a position now that Jews have not found themselves in for a few thousand years, and we are enjoying the best situation that Jews have had in those 2 millennia. But I think it's temporary, and I don't want to sound like some downer, but I think if you are aware of Jewish history, you know that all of these good periods ultimately come to an end. That doesn't mean that at the moment we shouldn't be looking at Amherst Jewish history and everything else. One thing I just want to add, totally unrelated, You may not know this, and there's no reason you should, but if you look at the stained glass windows in the chapel, you see the Dickinson family name there. You might be interested to know that the 2 descendants of the Dickinsons are Jewish. Yes, because they are our niece and nephew. That's how I know. So we sometimes look at the American Jewish experience and the loss of Jews into the larger population and huge concern over what's happening with all that. I don't think that's, in my opinion, I don't think that's a major problem. If you're like, it all depends on how you go about defining who is a Jew. And in a community like the JCA, where there is so much intermarriage going on and the children of intermarried couples, if you actually take a look at the numbers of Jews in America, that number is going up. And it's really not because of immigration. It's because of some of the intermarriage that's going on and the children from all of that. After all, if 2 Jews marry and have 2 children, there are 2 more Jews. If 2 Jews marry non-Jews and have children, and the potential for those children to be Jewish, again, the figures are all over the place, but at least a third or more of those children. And I can tell you, I don't want to monopolize this, but I can tell you as someone who teaches Jewish history over at UMass, most of my students are not Jewish, and the majority of the Jewish students I have come from intermarried families. And so those numbers are sort of interesting to watch. You might want to think about that in terms of taking any kind of history of the Jews in Amherst and Northampton and elsewhere.
I just want to say something about this, bringing up the Pew study and recent cultural identification, because it's really obviously a huge point of discussion in the wider American Jewish community. And we at the Yiddish Book Center actually feel like this isn't terrible. It really can be an opportunity to look at what are different aspects of the Jewish tradition to connect to. So, literature, we have a new program at the Yiddish Book Center that connects Jewish 20-somethings to Jewish aspects of American pop culture. And I think that there, just anecdotally from the people that come to our programs, that there is a growing complexity of what, of Jewish identification. But at least anecdotally, again, from who are coming to us, it may be someone who is adopted into a mixed marriage and so has a strong Chinese identity and American identity and Jewish identity, but the opportunity for Yiddish and American Jewish culture to be a way, to be a centerpiece to a modern Jewish identity is something, it's just an option that I think is not necessarily offered through Jewish institutional education, but it is an opportunity to connect, come to the history and culture from a different angle.
I could be the devil's advocate. I think we're talking all around of how the culture. I think we need to be more observant. I think we need to go to services. I think we need to let our children know where our loyalties. You don't have to keep a kosher house, but you can have Shabbat meals, you can sing Zemirot together. I don't think we're giving our children we're not putting ourselves. Sending a child to a Hebrew school, they might have a good Hebrew teacher who turns them on, but just as likely they won't. And if it's not coming from the parents, they're not going to have it unless some experience that they have accidentally pulls them in. So I think we need to do more as adults if we want our children to stay within Judaism.
I'll just add a little comment that probably fits with that I've been thinking about as I've been listening to this piece of the conversation, which is I lived in Charleston, South Carolina for 4 years, and what I saw down there, now every region is different, but what I saw down there was the Orthodox community, a new young Chabad rabbi, the conservative and the Reform, all doing programming together at different points. And I felt like it really helped pull the whole Jewish community together. So maybe a little piece of it is what probably all our rabbis are already doing, but to really encourage our rabbis to continue trying to work together and not just isolate the Orthodox over here and the Reform over there, that we can all work together.
Just in appreciating that comment and going back to Chaim, it makes you think about the Grinspoon Foundation and their Culture Connect and the way that they have connected all of Western Mass, including the Berkshires, in terms of at least knowing what's going on and the possibility of communicating. And I just wonder what role it's playing in the way that the fund played in those earlier years.
I'd like to raise a quick point since we have some folks from other cultures here. Do people, let's say from Irish cultures, do they think about the same issues too in terms of passing on Irish culture to their kids and what's happening to our culture? You know, is that an ongoing issue like it is for the Jewish people? Like, what's going to happen to the next generation? How do we pass on our culture? Is that a big issue?
I clearly believe that is so for all of the previous immigrant families in this country. My newest book is a grandmother's essays on education, and I have so many Jewish references, and I struggle can I just say Jews? But I come from Philadelphia. My first outside food experience was a Jewish deli. Oh my God, if I died and went to heaven. I wrote about the Brooklyn ladies in Jewish, because you cannot talk about education today and not talk about social welfare programs, and we've kind of lost our way. So, and the other thing is, I'm a product of Philadelphia Catholic schools. I'm proud of it. I can read and write and think, and I'm productive and a viable member of my community. We read the Old Testament, Torah. We called the Old Testament. That was part of our reading exercise, reading aloud, and so it served a double purpose, but it captured my imagination. I love anthropology, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, all of that captured my imagination. And what I'm saying to you now is, in telling those stories, you just don't know where it'll play out. Our children need to know it. My granddaughter is Dean's List at Rutgers, and in creative writing did political science fiction set 50 years in the future. And she talks about political turmoil and the cast of characters, what's happening in the world, getting ready for a war. And she belonged to a family, and she remembered her great-grandmother's stories about the history of this country. So we never know the seeds that we're planting when we tell our children's stories. But everything you were saying here today, I'm sitting thinking, that's our country today. We're struggling generationally with thinking we've lost the next two generations. We have to tell them the stories. It's become a secular society. It's a different world. And yeah, there's generational differences. But we have to decide, each one of us in our families, what we value as a family. And it's by saying to a child before they ever get to a school, this is what our family believes in. This is what we value. Those words will carry any child through difficult situations that they encounter with value systems that are different than theirs. So I think you're talking about the American society today. And we be a devil's advocate. We just have to figure out maybe we lost our way. And now we have to retell. I think we've figured, maybe we're just getting older. We have figured out who we are, but we know the stories, and we need to tell them to our children. Thank you.
I think just to say one other thing about that, cross-culturally, as I have looked, having this point of view of oral history, one theory that I think is applicable to this discussion is about American assimilationism and how the generation of immigrants were really concerned with blending in and forwarding bumping their children up the socioeconomic ladder, which I think speaks a little bit to what Ken, you were saying about peddlers having kids who become doctors and lawyers. But what we've seen at the Yiddish Book Center is then third generation and fourth generation, once they consider themselves very comfortably American, saying, okay, so I'm American, but what is this other thing? What is this other heritage? And that's where, at least I am observing in the young people who come to the center, what that curiosity comes from is heritage. And I would say that yes, from that is happening across cultures in my generation.
One thing I've noticed around my age, 60s, is there's so many people, independent of each other, are doing their own family histories, looking at the genealogy and doing a lot of their own research, and it's in like everyone. So I'm wondering at different stages of our development if people are seeking different information or about their family's past for different reasons. And I know my mother has had a big impact on my children. I remember my grandmother's stories, and I remember her telling me that when I saw the one who, that was her story in Poland. And she said that's just what it was, But things like that. I think when stories are told to you from a personal point of view, and you can own it. And I think this whole genealogy quest is our effort to own our own histories and our roots. One thing that I found very interesting was when one of my daughters was preparing for her bat mitzvah, we went to the Tenement Museum in the East Side, on the East Side. I recommend everyone go there. They have, we saw, there was a family from Turkey, a young woman from Turkey. We went up to the tenement where she lived and she talked to us. But they also have, I think there's an Italian tenement. There were different choices we could have seen beside Richard Street on the Lower Side.